Hello, everyone, and welcome. Uh, it's so nice to have everyone join us. I'm not sure about where you are, but on this rainy afternoon in Sewanee, at least, I am Casey Perkins, and I have the pleasure and joy of serving as the Director of Alumni Development and Church Relations here at the School of Theology. And as I see folks coming into the room, it's great to see some of our alums and friends of the seminary and other folks joining us today. So again, welcome. This is part of a series that we have been doing now for a couple of academic years, a lunch and learns with our faculty, a chance for you to hear what our faculty members are thinking about, researching, writing, the kinds of work that they're doing, and sometimes the classes that they're teaching. So it's a nice way for those especially who have left the mountain and sort of miss it to have a chance to reconnect with what's going on and the professors that you know and love, and new folks who join the faculty to get to hear from them and learn a little bit more about them. So today is the former category. We have the chance to hear from someone who's been on the faculty here for quite a while, and a real joy to have Paul Holloway with us today. A little bit of housekeeping before I introduce Dr. Holloway. I encourage you to use the Q&A feature in the webinar throughout the entirety of the presentation. If Dr. Holloway says something that sparks a question for you, go ahead and drop it in the Q&A so that when we get to the end of his time presenting, we'll have those questions ready and we can dive in and get to as many of them as time will allow. So be sure to use that Q&A feature. And then I'll say now, for those who may have to jump off right at the end, don't forget to look at our events page on the School of Theology website to check out the remaining 2 lunch and learns in this academic year series, as well as a few other live stream lectures that we have coming up. You can access that page easily at theology.swanee.edu, and then just click on the menu and choose lectures and events. So I would encourage you to do that and make sure that you are registered for things. As many of you know, if you register for an event and can't make it to the live event, we do send out recording information in the days following those events, and all of our recorded lectures do live on the website as well. So be sure to register so you'll get those emails. And then however you access the content, we're glad to be able to offer it for you. So without any further ado, I am pleased to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Paul Holloway is the University Professor of Classics and Ancient Christianity, and he teaches courses both at the School of Theology and in the College of Arts and Sciences. Prior to coming to Sewanee, he was the senior lecturer in New Testament and Christian origins in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies in the University of Glasgow, Scotland. He's a member of the Society of Biblical Literature and the prestigious Studiorum Novi Testamenti Societas. It's a real pleasure to be able to welcome Dr. Holloway today, and I will switch over to having him spotlighted for you all, and we can get going. Over to you, Dr. Holloway.
Great. Thank you, Casey, and welcome to those of you who have joined the webinar. So the title of my talk today is Paul's Anxious Letter to Rome, and it reflects some of my current work on Paul. I've sort of focused on Paul more and more over the past decade or so. I'm writing a commentary right now on 1 Corinthians for the International Critical Commentary series, and I'm also producing a volume on Romans for Morzebek. And putting the two together, sort of going back and forth from one to the other, has been a really good experience. Sometimes I'll work on Romans for a while and hit a roadblock, and then I'll stop and switch over to 1 Corinthians and find that I have a few more things to write about that. And then when I hit a block there, I go back to Romans. What I didn't expect was how my study of 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians was going to affect my reading of Romans. What's interesting, and I knew this, but I didn't realize how significant it was, is that Paul wrote Romans from Corinth in the wake of a considerable period of distress and disagreement in which he was effectively snubbed by some of his cultural betters in Corinth. Um, and that had an effect upon him. It affected his mental state. And I don't say that in a derogative way. I mean, we often speak out of hopes and fears and expectations, grief, fatigue. Lots of things affect our thinking and our writing or production discourse. Uh, and this was the case in Rome. The events that had transpired in his life over the past year and a half with his relationship with the Corinthians, um, they they were on his mind, and he learned a few things from them as well. So what I want to do here is talk about Paul's letter to Rome, his magnum opus. It is truly a magnificent achievement on his part, um, and the way in which the way he felt, the things that worried him, the experiences that he brought to it, shaped that letter. As a cultural historian, I'm interested in the history of what we might call the making of meaning, which is, constructing those sort of scaffolds that give purpose and reason and predictability to our life. And as a historian, I'm interested in the way those scaffolds change from time to time and alter from time to time. And so in this short lecture, webinar, I want to talk about Paul's great letter to Rome, which was certainly one of the principal artifacts of antiquity that have produced meaning for us today, continue to produce meaning for us. I want to talk about how it came to be written. And as the title of my lecture suggests, I want to look at Paul's anxieties at the time of writing. So I'm going to divide my comments into three parts. I want to make a few preliminary remarks about the letter to the Romans. I then want to highlight some of the lessons that Paul learned at Corinth and the kind of concerns that they would have produced in him as he wrote to the Romans. And then I want to look at a passage in Romans chapter 4 where he talks about Abraham's faith and see how his current concerns affected the way in which he wrote that famous chapter. So a little bit about the occasion of Romans. And Casey's going to handle the slides. I've got about 7 or 8 Bible verses I want to project. And so if he'll give you the first of those slides. There we go. So here we are in Romans 15, and Paul is about to end his very long and detailed letter to the Romans. And he writes this: "Now at last, with no further place for me in these regions," he's in Corinth, so he's about to shift the focus of his ministry from the eastern Mediterranean to the west. "With no further place for me in these regions, I desire, as I have for many years, to come to you when I go to Spain. For I do hope to see you on the way and to be aided on my journey by you." And I want to say a little bit about that expression, "to be aided on my journey," the Greek word propemphenai. I've highlighted it there. "Once I have enjoyed your company for a little while. At present, however, I am going to Jerusalem in a ministry to the saints." So Paul is in Corinth. He's about to head to Jerusalem, and then he wants to shift the center of his mission from the east to the west to Spain. And on the way to Spain, he wants to stop off in Rome and hopefully garner some support for his mission to Spain. That's what the word "to be aided on my journey" means. It could be financial support. It could be outfitting him with whatever he might need, letters of recommendation, perhaps for people that the Romans knew in Spain, perhaps a young man or two to go along with him, like Timothy and Titus had done back in the East. And he would have needed help with the language. He was a Greek speaker, a native Greek speaker, and in Spain, the language that he would have been most familiar with, not the local languages, would have been Latin, and I suspect he would have needed considerable help preaching and communicating in that. So Paul is about to head to Jerusalem and then on to Rome and to Spain, but there's some problems that he will face in Rome. So, Casey, if you could just show us the next slide. Um, so here he is in Romans 7. Some of the hurdles that he would face there. First of all, Rome was not a church that he planted, so they had never met Paul. And what would complicate things more is that they had a different gospel than he had. They were much more focused on observing the Jewish Torah. And as you will probably know, I think we all probably know, Paul's view was that Gentiles did not have to observe Torah to be faithful followers of Christ. But not only were they observing Torah and not, accepting Paul's theory of the gospel, as he says here, for I realize I'm speaking to those who know the law. So they were well educated in the Torah. The chances are that many of them had attended synagogue, had come out of the synagogues, perhaps even were still attending synagogues. There wasn't a break at this point between Jews and the emerging Christ following group. And so he has to write to them in a way that takes into account that they know the law, and he'll have to be very careful in the kind of arguments he gives. In the case of, he had run into a similar situation in Galatia, but the Galatians did not know the law. And as we'll see, he was able to produce arguments there that maybe might not have passed muster in Rome. So he's going to have to tighten those up and fill out any gaps. So I want to now shift just a bit and talk about his experience in Corinth. And there are two texts I want to look at. So Casey, if you could there we go. Paul came to Corinth after he had visited Athens. We know from his letter to the Thessalonians that he wrote Thessalonians from Athens, and then obviously he moved on to Corinth from there. In the book of Acts, we hear that he didn't do too well in Athens. He was snubbed. He was among his intellectual betters, his cultural betters, his social betters, and he struck out. So he goes to Corinth, and there he gains a hearing, a foothold among some of the lower classes of the city. In chapter 1, he says, look at your calling. Not many of you are well-born. Not many of you are wise. Not many of you are powerful, things of that sort. So the initial conversion of folks there was among this group of people. Things went pretty well, apparently. Paul left. And then a fellow named Apollos, a very well-educated Jew from Alexandria, who was also a believer in Christ, may have actually studied with Philo of Alexandria, the great Jewish exegete and intellectual there. At any rate, Apollos comes, and he converts a number of people to Christ's belief, baptizes them, and it would seem that he gained a following among the city's elite. This was his social group, and presumably he converted members of that group. And they didn't have much opinion of Paul. And so he was shunned by them. He was looked down upon by them. They criticized him for his speaking, for his ideas, lacked wisdom, lacked eloquence. And so Paul in chapter 10 of 2 Corinthians is looking back on, kind of taking stock of the situation. And here he quotes them. They say, and that would be his detractors, probably not Apollos, probably his converts, but anyway, people in Corinth of a better with a better education, better status, standing than Paul. He says, for they say, quote, his letters are weighty and strong. So he writes a pretty good letter. But don't forget, his bodily presence is weak. we would say lame, and his speech is contemptible, exuthenemenos, next to nothing, good for nothing. So Paul learned in the course of his dealings with the Corinthians that he could, with effort, write a good letter, but that he was not impressive in person, both in the way in which he projected himself physically, and also in the way in which he spoke. And so he learned a positive lesson here. He could write a good letter if he tried. He got some help probably, but he wasn't going to make a good impression in person. So if he was going to make an impression, it had to be in writing. And I think this is precisely why he writes to the Romans before he goes there. He knows that, you know, his best chance to garner their support is going to be in the way in which he's able to project himself in this fabulous letter that he obviously took 2 or 3 weeks to write. I can't imagine that he could have done that in any shorter period of time. It's also interesting that in writing to the Romans, we learn about the second to last verse, a fellow named Tertius says, "And I, Tertius, greet you. I'm the person who helped Paul write this letter." He was an amanuensis, probably a skilled, scribe, we might say, in the house of some wealthy Corinthian. He identifies himself as a believer, but at any rate, he poor Tertius probably took dictation and corrections from Paul for probably upwards of a month or so, my best guess. And so the next slide, we'll find here's Paul a few verses later in 2 Corinthians 11. He's quoted them as saying, he may write a good letter, but don't forget what he was like in person. Don't forget his physical demeanor and presentation, and don't forget his, the light in my office just went off just a second. It's one of those things that, yeah, if you move it, it comes back on. Okay, so hopefully I won't have to do that, but 1 or 2 more times in the course of the webinar. At any rate, so they have said that his speech is contemptible, that his physical presence is unimpressive, but that he writes a good letter. So here he is now, sort of digging his heels in. He's writing now, but even if I am untrained in speech, and he's allowing that, even if my public speaking skills are not as good as theirs, I'm certainly not with respect to knowledge, gnosis. And certainly in every way and in all things, we have made this evident to you. So he thinks he is, and for all we know, he was certainly had a tremendous impact intellectually. He was a theorist of the gospel. Okay, I don't want to call him a theologian just yet because I think that's a certain level of reflection and care that he didn't have, was not afforded given how busy he was. But I will call him a theorist of the gospel. What's interesting here is not just that he was a theorist of the gospel, I think we could all admit that, but that he knew he was. I certainly am not with respect to knowledge. So what's happened here is Paul has gained a sense of himself that he didn't have before this. So as I look at Paul, and as I imagine Paul sitting in Corinth writing his letter to the Romans, I think that in the back of his mind, he's brought with him a couple of lessons. 2 of them are negative. You don't impress people with your looks, and you don't impress people with your public speaking. But 2 of the lessons were positive, and they were that he could write a good letter with help. So he writes him a letter with help. And I think this is key, this will deeply influence his letter to the Romans, that he could think well, that he was a theorist. The other item that I would emphasize here is that if Paul was snubbed in Athens and then later snubbed in Corinth, he would almost certainly face that kind of cultural, intellectual snobbery in Rome. So I think that there was a certain anxiety um, as Paul wrote to the Romans about how he would be received in the city. And this would have been exacerbated by the fact not only that they were, residents of the imperial mother city, the imperial metropole, but that they had a different view of the gospel than he did, and they were relatively well educated in the Jewish Torah. Um, and then making matters even worse, he actually needed their support. It wasn't just that he wanted a friendly visit along the way, but it was that he wanted them to send him on his way to aid him in his journey. Remember that first verse that we looked at, propemphenai, to send me on, to help me on my way, to give him the provisions, personal, interpersonal, financial, that he would need to succeed. And so there's a lot at stake here. And as he writes this letter, I think he puts everything he has into it. He knows he can write a good letter if he tries, and so he tries. It is a long letter. It is an impressive letter. He gets the services of this skilled scribe to help him over quite a period of time to do this. And he pulls out all the stops in terms of his theorizing the gospel. Um, I'm actually working on an article right now called Paul's Theorizing the Gospel, and it's about what he does in Romans. So with that in mind, I want to look at a particular text in Romans. If we could just advance the slide here. Yeah. So Paul is, in making the case for his gospel to the Romans, um, he is going to draw upon an experience that he had not in Corinth, but in Galatia. In his letter to the assemblies in Galatia that he had founded, he's dealing probably for the first time in his ministry with a very strong case that Gentiles should observe Torah. If they're going to follow a Jewish Messiah, they should accept the Jewish law and live accordingly. Men should be circumcised, and they should all observe the various cultural practices of Judaism. And so Paul has to argue that Gentiles don't need to do that in order to follow Christ effectively. And how's he going to do that? Well, he, at this point, seems to invent his doctrine, his famous doctrine of justification by faith. He will use this text from Genesis 15:6 that is quoted right here in Galatians, and I'll just read it. Just as Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him for righteousness, know then that those who are of faith are the sons of Abraham. So he quotes this text, and he will make the case that it's not by observing Torah that one achieves this level of righteousness, but that it is by faith. It is by believing God. And then he offers this very short interpretation. Know then that those who are of faith, that it is those who are of faith who are the sons of Abraham. And that's it. That is as much interpretation as he gives to that text. He quotes it as though it proved his point, and then he makes a kind of an application to the case of the Galatians. Because they're people of faith, they're sons of Abraham, they don't need to keep the Torah, but that they're perfectly in good standing with God through their faith. And that's as far as he takes it in Galatians. In Romans, on the other hand, he is going to spend 25 verses explicating this passage from Genesis 15:6. They know the law, and they know how it has been interpreted, and Paul is going to have to work pretty hard to make Genesis 15:6 say what he wants it to say. So what we have in Romans 4 is what scholars call a midrash. It's an agadic midrash or a narrative midrash. It takes a bit of a story from the Old Testament and it elaborates that story in a kind of an interpretive effort, an interpretive context. Now, the problem that Paul faces in using the Genesis 15:6 text, Abraham believed God and it was reckoned to him for righteousness, is that this was a well-known text in Paul's day. We have at least 4 or 5 references to it in Second Temple Jewish literature, and they interpret it in exactly the opposite way that Paul did. So he's got his work cut out for him. He's going to have to actually overcome their interpretation and propose convincingly his own novel interpretation. One that he's the first that we know of to have read the text this way. So here's Ben Sira. Ben Sira is writing in Jerusalem probably about 200 years before Christ. And here is chapter 44 of his text, his wisdom text, in which he discusses the example of Abraham. And this is all about his reading of Genesis 15:6. I'll read this text to you and then point out a few of its features. Abraham was the great father of a multitude of nations. That was the promise that God had made to Abraham in Genesis 17. And his equal in glory was not found. He carefully kept the law of the Most High. It was believed at this point in time that Abraham actually had access to the Mosaic law prior to Moses. And he entered into a covenant with God. In his flesh, he established this covenant, and that's a reference to circumcision. Abraham was circumcised himself, and had all the male members of his family circumcised in Genesis 17. And when he was tested, he was found faithful. Now, the test here is his willingness to sacrifice Isaac. And this is in Genesis 22. And it says, and he was found faithful, pistos, which is cognate to the verb he believed God, epistos, in Genesis 15:6. So the theory is here, as the way in which Ben Sira is reading Genesis 15:6, is that it's actually a statement about God, about Abraham's faithfulness. Abraham was faithful to God, and it was reckoned to him for righteousness, which basically means he was obedient to the command to circumcise himself and his family, men in his family, and that he was also obedient to God when God ordered him to sacrifice Isaac. And then, as a result of that obedience, God blesses him. God assures, therefore the Lord assured him with an oath that the nations would be blessed through his offspring, and that he would make him as numerous as the dust of the earth, and exalt his offspring like the stars. So this is the way in which Genesis 15:6 was read. Now the next slide is from First Maccabees. And Maccabees was written after Ben Sira, maybe about 100 years or so afterward. And it appears that Maccabees is quoting from, or is using Ben Sira's interpretation. Let's read the text and then I'll point that out to you. Remember the deeds of the ancestors, which they did in their generations, and you will receive great honor and an everlasting name. For example, was not Abraham, when he was tested, found faithful? And that expression, when he was tested, he was found faithful, is an exact quote. It's not put in quotation marks there, but it's an exact quote of Ben Sira. So probably, this is probably just a follow-up reading of Genesis 15:6 from Ben Sira. But what's interesting is, whereas Ben Sira alludes to Genesis 15:6, the author of First Maccabees actually quotes it. Was not Abraham, when he was tested, found faithful, and this was reckoned to him for righteousness? So notice that Genesis 15:6 here is being interpreted as Abraham was faithful to God, we translate Abraham believed, and it was reckoned to him for righteousness. But the way current Jewish interpretation interpreters were reading the text is that Abraham was actually obedient to God. He was faithful to God's commands, and that was reckoned to him for righteousness. So you can see that this just quoting this text is not going to convince the Romans that Paul is right. They know the law and current interpretations of it, and Genesis 15:6 was a famous text. It's quoted in a number of other Second Temple Jewish texts. Jubilees quotes it twice. And of course you find it in the New Testament in the letter of James, who follows the traditional Jewish interpretation and is actually explicitly against Paul. It's a reaction. The letter to James is a reaction to Paul's letter to the Romans, I think. At any rate, so Paul's got his work cut out for him. And so what he has to do in Romans 4 is not just quote the text and add a clause afterwards, but he actually has to offer a midrash on it, and sort of detailed reading, close reading of the text. So Casey, you want to show the next slide, please? Yeah. So here we are in Romans 4. And we begin with this conversation that Paul is having with an imaginary interlocutor. What then are we to say that our ancestor Abraham found according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. So it may be that Abraham was viewed as a righteous man based on his behavior, but that's not why God viewed him as a righteous man. And then Paul quotes the scripture, this Genesis 15:6. For what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Now there's the text. They're not going to read it the way Paul wants to read it, but there's the text. Abraham believed God. They would have read this. Abraham was faithful to God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. So at this point, Paul performs a technique, an interpretive technique called midrash. And midrash was of various forms, but in this case, Paul focuses on two words in the text, the verbs, and I've highlighted them. Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. And so Paul, in his interpretation of the text, is going to focus on those two words, the two verbs, believe and reckon. And he's going to take them in reverse order. So in Romans 4, and I think now the one who works is, I believe that's verse 3, maybe verse 4. I don't have it marked there for you on the slide. He begins with reckoned, and you can see I've highlighted the verb reckon in this text. Now I've highlighted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times Paul repeats that word. So he's going to interpret that verb. What does that verb mean? Now, to one who works, wages are not reckoned as though it were a gift, but as something owed. But to the one who does not work, but trusts, and there's the word belief, but it's obvious now that it's something other than obey. Him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is reckoned as righteousness. So also David pronounces a blessing on those to whom God reckons righteousness apart from work. So now he's not just quoting the Genesis text, he wants to quote Psalm 31, which he attributes to David. Blessed are those whose iniquities are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one against whom the Lord will not reckon sin. And then he asks this question, and I think this gets to the meat of what he wants to produce here. Is this blessing then pronounced only on the circumcised or also on the uncircumcised? We say that faith was reckoned to Abraham as righteousness. How then was it reckoned to him? Was it before or after he had been circumcised? It was not after, but before. Paul does a couple of things here. I'll mention one of them, and that is that he, by focusing on the word reckon, he turns Genesis 15:6 not into a description of Abraham's life, but into an event. He says, so when did this occur? And he's going to say, did it happen before he was circumcised are after he was circumcised. And notice at this point, it can't be a way of life. It's not something that exists that describes Abraham's life from the circumcision of himself to the sacrifice of Isaac as a young man. It's an event. And it's an event that can then be located relative to other events. And so by focusing on the verb reckoned, he makes it not only an act of grace, as she does or in the first sentence, his wages are reckoned as a gift, as an act of grace, not as a payment that's owed. But then he goes on to say, and this occurred at a particular point in time. And at this point, he begins to undercut the regnant interpretation, which was that Abraham's whole life was then viewed by God as a form of righteousness, or that it passed for righteousness. Okay, so that's the first verb. It turns the verse Abraham believed God and it was reckoned to him as righteousness into an event that can be located on a particular timeline. Okay, Casey, you want to do the next slide, please? Great. Now we turn to verses 13 to 23, where Paul takes up this other verb, and that is to believe. And he uses the word faith a couple of times. That's the noun. It's cognate to the word believe. And then he will sometimes use the verb believe. I think he uses it like 7 times. If we can count here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times the word faith or believe is used here. So now he's shifted from his interpretation of the word reckon to his interpretation of the word believe. And what I want to point out here, and we get to this just at the sort about halfway through, where it starts hoping against hope, is that he wants to describe Abraham's belief as his reaction to a promise. Remember, in the traditional interpretation, Abraham is obeying command. But in this passage, Paul wants to interpret that event. Remember, by focusing on reckon, he turns it into an event. Now he wants to locate that event, and he's going to be able to say, given his reading of the immediate context of Genesis 15:6, that this event was that it was in response to a promise. So my light just went out again. So I'll have to stand up and see if I can, oh, there we go, came back on. So we're saving money, but probably not the best environment for a webinar over 20 minutes long. At any rate, we're good for another 20 minutes, I suspect. So what's happening here? Let's go back to the text. Hoping against hope, he believed that he would become the father of many nations, and that's the promise of Genesis 17:5, according to what had been promised, what was previously promised, so shall your descendants be. And that's Genesis 15:5. So this promise that is later made in great detail in Genesis 17, Paul says, but look, it is prefigured in another form. In that promise is given in a slightly different form back in Genesis 15:5. And Abraham belief is a response to that promise, not a response to a command. In Genesis 17, the command to circumcise, Genesis 22, the command to sacrifice his son, but all the way back in Genesis 15, and in the verse right before the verse that he wants to interpret, God has made Abraham a promise. And so in response to that promise, Abraham believes. So Abraham's faith is not his faithful obedience to a command, chapter 17, chapter 22, but Abraham's faith is his trust, his belief in a promise made in Genesis 15:5. So he turns it into an event, and then he locates that event in this narrative in Genesis 15 and says, look, right before that, God made a promise. And so the way to interpret Genesis 15:6 is to see it as Abraham's response to a promise. It's a brilliant piece of exegesis. It's absolutely new on the scene. And to drive the point home, Paul, who's obviously given this a great deal of thought, he then psychologizes Abraham's faith. And I don't know that this kind of inner life, this internalist reading of a character is all that developed in the Hebrew Bible. But Paul is going to develop it considerably here. Kind of reminds me of what we're going to find later in Augustine. Hoping against hope. He's now describing this struggle to believe the promise. Okay, God has made him a promise. It's a pretty outrageous promise, and now Abraham's going to have to believe it. Hoping against hope, he believed that he would become the father. He believed that he would become the father of many nations, according to what was promised, so shall your descendants be. He did not weaken in faith. This is still exploring this internal life of faith in Abraham. He did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body, which was as good as dead, or when he considered the barrenness of Sarah's womb. No unbelief, again, working with this idea of faith, this is a cognate to that, no unbelief, apostia, made him waver concerning the promise, there you have, promise again, of God, but he grew strong in his faith and he gave glory to God, being fully convinced, very a very rich and dramatic description of his trust, being fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised, and that's why it was reckoned to him for righteousness. And so now he has interpreted this phrase in a way that undercuts the traditional view and that supports his view. You can do this with every chapter of Romans. My thesis is that Paul was a bit anxious about how he would be received in Rome. And so he wrote them this very thoughtful, very long letter touting his knowledge. He now sees himself as a theorist, the first theorist of emergent Christianity. And he leans into it in this letter. And that is why we have the letter to the Romans. And so to just return to my title, Paul's anxious letter to Rome, I think that it is precisely that the energy created, the inventiveness created by that anxiety about how he would be received in Rome and whether he would find funding and support for his work in Spain. It's that anxiety that then gave us this tremendous artifact, which is the letter to the Romans. So that's what I have to offer. That's kind of where my head is these days, this chapter and other chapters in Romans. And so, Casey, I think that you've been collecting questions. I don't know if any have come in. I can't tell. Do you want to relate those to me or? Yep.
Sure, I will. Let me make sure I've got everything like it's supposed to be. Okay, so yes, please drop questions in, folks, if you've got them, but I'll start with the one here. This person asks, what is Paul's definition or vision of, quote, the gospel? You call him a theorist of the gospel, but it is very likely the gospels as we know them today were not even written yet.
Yes, yes. Yes, so a couple of things there. That's an excellent question. I mean, a couple of things there. The Gospels, when we talk about the Gospel of Mark or the Gospel of Matthew, that's a genre. Okay, we're talking about a type of literature and a new type of literature, right? I mean, this is the first Gospel was Mark, and it was not like anything that had been before it. It drew upon pieces of biography and history, and monographs and things of that sort. But it wasn't like anything else. So it was a new genre. When Paul uses the word gospel, and when I use the word gospel about Paul, I'm talking about a message. I'm talking about his proclamation. And so they're in some ways they're obviously closely related. But so Paul is not thinking about gospel in the sense of Gospel of Mark. No, but Paul has has finished his course and has been martyred, I believe, in Rome. Is the best guess that I think folks have these days about how his life ended. Never made it to Spain, made it to Rome on a prison ship. Wasn't exactly what he was thinking when he wrote this letter, but when Paul used the word gospel, he's talking about his proclamation. The gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were not written for another several decades after Paul, and maybe well on into the early second century. Yeah. So what does Paul mean by the gospel? Well, I think that changed over time. In First Thessalonians, he summarizes his early gospel, which is in First Thessalonians 1, 9, and 10. He says, how you turn to God from idols to serve the living and true God, and to wait for his Son from heaven. So there's no cross here. There's no atonement here. Those theories have not been those uh, bits and pieces not yet been assimilated into Paul's theory. He'll talk about the cross for the first time in Corinthians. He'll talk about the blood of Christ and as a propitiation for the first time in Romans 3 and again in Romans 5. So I think Paul's gospel evolved, it changed. Initially, it seems that the earliest good news was that Christ rose from the dead. So probably the first gospel was, he came back. he defeated death. Um, but then the problem persisted. Why was he killed in the first place? What was the point of that? And then various theories of atonement arise. So that by the time you get to the end of Paul's life, he has pretty much what we think of as the gospel. I also think that until Paul sort of crafted his theology of the cross, it was probably impossible to write a gospel, a narrative gospel. In some ways, Paul's theology of the cross was the condition for the possibility of a gospel that sort of focuses on and drives toward a crucifixion. So until Paul had sort of theorized the crucifixion, as he would do in his later letters, I don't think it was, it was possible to write a gospel. So that's a great question. I mean, lots of stuff implicated in that.
Wonderful. Um, I don't have another question at the moment. Um, well, one thing I am just personally curious, and I
Sure.
didn't get to have you for New Testament in seminary. So I'm just sort of curious. I have always been sort of fascinated with development of the canon of
Mm-hmm.
scripture as it is, and obviously we have what we have, but I am just sort of curious, especially hearing you talk about the references being made to other writings,
Mm-hmm.
what your thoughts are, how you would riff on, revising the canon, the order, if you were able to do so. Just how
Right.
might our reading be sculpted by the way that we're presented the texts, as
Right.
opposed to how you might see them working better somehow.
Right. Right. Well, this is a problem that anybody who teaches an introduction to the New Testament, which I do every year and enjoy, um, faces, because we want to do it historically, but there's just something kind of perverse about treating Paul before Jesus, and so plus I think the Gospels teach much easier than Paul does. We've got four of them, and they can be read in tandem. We can talk about the way in which Matthew copied and used Mark and edited Mark and things of that sort. So we can sort of get into a critical historical reading of the New Testament much easier in the Gospels. But the fact is, they are actually downstream from the letters of Paul. Um, the canon of, why is it organized this way? It's organized in terms of genre. This had already happened in the Hebrew Bible when it was translated into Greek. Then the documents within the Hebrew scriptures were organized according to oracles, poetry, wisdom, law, that kind of thing. Uh, and so I think that it was just natural in the Greek-speaking and Latin-speaking world to think in terms of genres, so we organize in that way. And then I think I think in general it would be kind of perverse to think of putting Paul before Jesus. I don't think that sits well with folks. It even seems kind of weird to me.
Sure.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
Couple of questions have come in. This one asks, what indicates that the letter of Romans took a few months, I believe you said, to write?
Yeah. Yeah, I think I said a few weeks, but yeah, I don't think I think a few months would have been probably trying poor Tertius's patience. I just can't imagine writing something like that in any period of time shorter than that. I mean, Paul's dictating this. He's thinking through his arguments. Um, what would have probably happened is he would have dictated these things to Tertius. They might have discussed it, something like that. I want to talk about this and this and this. Um, the and then Tertius would have written these things down on a wax tablet, on a collection of wax tablets. He was probably a tachygrapher, which means he could speed write, but kind of like shorthand. That would have then been, I think, maybe transferred into some rough piece of papyrus, not too expensive. It was an expensive process. Tertius was obviously, on retainer of a very wealthy Corinthian, probably Gaius, Paul's host. So Paul was provided with these resources. That's why getting a letter of this sort, of this length, would have been a compliment. I mean, this would have been very impressive to receive a letter that was, what turns out now to be about 40 pages of the critical Greek text, Nessalon text. So yeah, I just can't imagine that this could have been done in any shorter period of time. The other thing, Ed Sanders died in 2022. He was a terrific interpreter of Paul, very sympathetic, but also very critical and thoughtful. And he says that Paul, did a lot of this work as he wrote. In other words, his thinking was always a work in progress. That makes excellent sense to me. I don't think he was inventing this stuff out of whole cloth, but I do think he was that it was a work in progress, and that it was always that. Paul had an incredibly energetic mind. I think he was not educated, but he was brilliant, and he was a sponge. He took things in. So much of Greek and Roman culture was done out in the open. All the trials were out in the open. These great orators, you would have heard them speak in the city square. And Paul, as a culturally insecure person, which he increasingly became with good reason, he would have just absorbed, been to plays and things of that. That's what I think. And so he's very busy, starting these churches, um, writing back and forth, monitoring this collection, working with his hands sometimes to support himself, having 4 or 5 assistants that he was sending all around the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean. Thinking ahead, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, then I'm going to go to Rome, then I'm going to go to Spain. An incredible journey just to even imagine. So he's an incredibly busy man. He's an incredibly smart man. He's motivated, deeply motivated. He has these life-changing experiences. He's a mystic of the first order. Um, and so I think that he is working these things out even as he writes. And so for example, we see his ideas changing over the course of his letters. And I think for Paul, it was always a work in progress. He was trying to understand, trying to figure it out, trying to explain it. And that only became more intense as his view of himself changed, as he saw himself as a theorist, and that this was his contribution. And eventually he realized that he was not going to be around when Christ came back. And so I think there is a sense in which his later letters are in some sense his legacy, even if he wasn't fully conscious of that.
We've got several more questions that have come in. I'm going to try to ask you the ones that I think will have short answers so that we can try to
Okay,
get through them all.
good.
One asks, how many people were associated with the Roman house churches at the time of the letter?
We don't know. We can identify 3 or 4 of those house churches, and so I would think maybe upwards of 100 or more people in Rome were going to these various house churches. Yeah.
You mentioned Ed Sanders. Who are some other scholars on Paul that you would recommend?
Paula Fredrickson, my friend Paula Fredrickson, who's at the Center for Advanced Studies in Jerusalem, brilliant Paul scholar. There's a younger scholar at Princeton Seminary, Matt Novenson, and Matt is just burning it up. He's a terrific scholar. So Novenson, Novenson, and Fredrickson, Fredriksen. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. And let's see. This one asks, does, quote, son of Abraham mean exactly like Abraham, like son of man and son of God?
Oh, yeah. That's a tough one. Son of God was actually a messianic title that goes back to Solomon. Genesis in 2 Samuel 7:14, God says through Nathan to David, he will be a son to me, and I will be a father to him. So, son of God is a Hebrew idiom for the Messiah, for the anointed. Uh, Son of Man goes back to Daniel 7 and is probably an angel. So when we think of Jesus as the Son of Man, he's this sort of pre-existent figure. So it's the exact opposite of what Ignatius of Antioch said. His humanity is the Son of Man, and his divinity is Son of God. It's the exact opposite of that. Son of God is human, Messiah, and Son of Man is a divinity. Son of Abraham, descendant of Abraham, heir of Abraham, someone who would inherit Abraham's blessing. Um, Probably uh, neither. It's not an analogy with either son of God or son of man. So it's a difficult question. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. This might be our last one.
Okay.
This question says, Midrash is a practice that happens in community. Do we have any evidence or knowledge that Paul may have discussed these theories and new ideas about the Hebrew scripture / Old Testament?
Yeah, I can't imagine that he didn't discuss them with his associates. Sometimes when he writes his letters, he'll say Paul and Timothy to so and so, or Paul and Silas or Silvanus or something like that. No, I don't think Paul kept quiet about these things. I just don't see that as the case. Yeah, no, I think these interpretations were communitarian. Although I will say this, when Paul starts his letters by saying, Paul and Timothy or Paul and Silas, he immediately goes to the first person singular, I. So I do think there is this imprint of Paul's individual personality on this. And yes, I'm sure he sharpened himself up by discussing these things with his colleagues. But what we have on on the pages of the New Testament letters that are authentic of Paul is the mind of this great apostle.
Well, that feels like a really great place to end our time today. It is right on the hour, and we're so grateful to everyone for joining us today. Again, don't forget to check in with our other upcoming events. We've got another Lunch and Learn coming up with Richard Kogel, and then Dean Terrell will round out the semester towards the end of April with our final Lunch and Learn of this term. So thank you, Dr. Holloway, for your time today, and thank you all for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you the next time.
Thank you, Casey.